Hi, I'm Walter Schlecht. I'm Germanic Languages and Literatures and Comparative Literature Subject Librarian at the University Libraries of Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm thrilled that you're a part of the International Writers Series. Just some technical things before I turn it to Matthias. This is a webinar, so your camera and microphone are already turned off, and sorry, I lost my train of thought. Your camera are already turned off. This is recording. We'll upload it to YouTube later, but again, you will not be part of the recording. If there are any questions, you can put any technical questions, you can put them in the chat. But for the hour, we'll be focused on the conversation with Anca, Matthias, and Mary Jo. Without further ado, I'll hand this over to Matthias.
Welcome and welcome back for this first event of the fourth season of the International Writers Series, a collaboration between the International Writers track of the program in Comparative Literature and the University Libraries to celebrate new publications of creative works by writers and translators in our community at Washington University in St. Louis. Premieres are always special. Red carpets, great expectations, champagne, a glitzy movie atmosphere, the excitement of something new. And Walter, you just shared the wonderful picture, but that kind of does not allow me to read my introduction. So thank you so much. This is what happens at premieres. Today is such a special day since the book we are talking about, Romanian poets Andra Rotaru's collection Tribar in the original, is coming out today, hot off the press. Tribar was translated by poet and translator Anca Roncea, who grew up in Romanian, speaks modern Greek, French, and writes in English. She has lived in Bucharest, Iowa City, Yangon, Los Angeles, Paris, and New York. Through her works, she explores the space between languages and how that can create pivots in the midst of displacement, retracing the aesthetics of the women artists of the Dada movement. Her first collection of poetry, touching again upon language, poetry, and experimental translation, is thus titled Exophony. She's a current PhD student in the Washington University in St. Louis program of the International Writers track. She's also a graduate of the Iowa's Writers Workshop, the University of Iowa's Literary Translations MFA program, and her work can be found in the Berkeley Poetry Review, Beaches Magazine, Omniverse, and Asymptote, the Bear Life Review, and Lana Turner. Her fascinating translation of Andra Rotaru's Tribar is now available from Saturnalia Books, and it is Anca's first full-length book publication. So yes, this is a premiere. Tribar starts from the geometrical concept of an impossible triangle. We will hear about this just like in a second. Andra Rotaru's poetic work has developed from some of her encounters with modern dance choreography, which kind of connects her work with Anca's work, because she's also working about dancers in the Dada movement. And Rotaru's poems simultaneously mimic and track the body in motion. Her connections, or as we might hear about, impossible connections, become joints or articulated bones that work together to carry the body along. This translation of Anca's recreates this embodiment in English by focusing on the minute detail of movement and sound in Andra's language, and on the, as she quotes in her beautiful afterword in her translator's note, the kinetic air of the Romanian. Poet Savako Nakayasu describes Tribar as scenes that, quote, carry you through a changing landscape that can be menacing, historical, scientific, or downright violent, all in talked connection with each other, like the incorrect connections of the Tribar. A Romanian literary critic, Ipana Botenaru, describes this book as a, quote, choreography of visions, impregnated with explanations, definitions, and confessions, at the end of which the instance, which found relief in the smell of milk on its knees, manages to emerge from the wound, rediscovering self-joy. Some of my favorite lines from this collection seem to touch a lot of what we will talk about today, and Anca is also quoting them and elaborating on them in her afterword. Quote, I am always going home, always to my father's house, even if today this voice is foreign, I will use it. Anca Roncea will be joined in discussion by celebrated poet and translator Mary Jo Bang. Mary Jo is the author of 8 books of poems, including Elegy, which received the National Book Critics Circle Award, and translations of Dante's Inferno, illustrated by Henrik Drescher, and Purgatorio, which we presented last in our writer series in December or in November. I can't really remember. She has received a Hodder Fellowship from Princeton University, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Berlin Prize Fellowship. She teaches creative writing at Washington University in St. Louis, and we are really, really happy to have her with us tonight. You can find Mary Jo Bang's papers in the library's Modern Literature collection at Washington University, and you will be rewarded visiting them by finding all the depth a poet's life can muster. I would like to thank Washington University's library for making these events possible, as well as the Committee of Comparative Literature and simply all other departments of arts and sciences and numerous individuals who are involved. I want furthermore to take a moment to express my special thanks and deep gratitude to our incomparable subject librarian Walter Slecht, who is my partner in crime in setting up the International Writer Series. He is, as you know, currently overseeing all the technical stuff of our webinar and sharing wonderful pictures of the book cover. Please join me in welcoming Anca Roncea and Mary Jo Bang with a big round of virtual applause. Enjoy the conversation and the reading from Andra Rotaru's Tribar during the next 60 minutes, and a special applause to Anca Roncea because it is 3 o'clock in the morning in Romania. Thank you for joining us.
Anca, do you want to begin by reading something so that the audience can know about this book we're about to talk about?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. This is very exciting, and it truly feels like a celebration of this book. So I'll start by reading a couple of poems from the first pages of the book, and then perhaps we can discuss it a little bit. Wrong connections. In the British Journal of Psychology, R. Penrose published The Impossible Tribar. Penrose called it a 3-dimensional rectangular structure, but it is certainly not the projection of an intact spatial structure. The impossible tribar holds together as a drawing purely and simply by means of incorrect connections between quite normal elements. The 3 right angles are completely normal, but they have been joined together in a false, spatially impossible way. This is a quote from The Magic Mirror by M.C. Escher, Bruno Ernst. We paint a realist portrait of the person next to us or draw an overview of their past. We can observe the either limited or prodigious functioning of their sensory organs. Eyes, mouth, skin gather information about the outside world that the brain can process and then decide how to proceed. Some species survive through their senses, dogs through smell, bats through hearing. Approximately 80% of what the human brain processes is out of seeing things. Let's watch the various stages. 1920, approximating the grandmother. She sits on a tuft of grass, drying under her. Even her clothes dry on her. Make some wishes when you throw something in the water. Rust solders iron underwater. No one passes. Sounds of bursts of water. Membranes in every organ break the ones close. Packs of wild creatures break the dawn. The smell of dry skin and water tossing. Water thumping. They stretch out their claws and grab organisms leaping out. Mill blades turn. The axis spreads the motion. The constant supply in the upper part of the mill. Below flour and bran. Kinetic air, mechanical air. The energy of an old woman at the edge of water. Crack. When hair hits hair. In the 1940 photograph, the woman had a stroller next to her. In it, a little girl held a wooden horse, its mane of 3,172 coarse hairs. Every time the saddle rocked, a hair cracked. The photograph was taken when the mane was certain to calm down the infant. Otherwise, the little girl would suck on her nails until crack. They'd form a ditch rising in the middle, and the corneous formation would remain so forever. Her fingers would end in ingrown claws, unnecessary deformities. Nash, when Denton Gibbs, when her first teeth came out, the woman soothed her gums with alcohol-infused cotton balls. The child let out a shrill cry. Her gums swelled and the redness from the alcohol resembled necrosis. When she put ice in a gauze pouch on the outer cheek, the pain became bearable. A twinge went across through her body. She clenched her teeth so hard, the pressure of the upper teeth on the lower escaped in a snap. The imminent corrosion of enamel. Blink. The unpredictability of a figure turned asymmetrical. The axis on which two eyes can seem symmetrical, either close up or far away, is perturbed. When palms clap, out of fear, the little girl closes her eyelids. It happens so fast, not even dolls with plastic eyes can imitate her. She often presses her eyelids until they become purple. Someone's mere gaze becomes painful, causes her spasms. These muscles pulled at from every side make the eyes twitch a few seconds. Gnaw a child's fingers. Soft pink tissue macerated inside the mouth. Lips stick to the bony surface of the phalanges. She savors the tough protein material, the appendix of the skin. Keratin. What does the root grow out of?
Okay. What's so interesting to read it on the page and then to hear you read it is that the audience who's just hearing it doesn't know that there are these boxes, which have an effect, I think, on the reader, because we feel like there's something, we're being given something, and we don't know exactly what that package represents, like a quote or another voice or what. So how do you think those boxed texts work with the other text? And did you have to understand that to translate it?
That's a really good question, and I think it speaks to one of the challenges of this book. For sure, I think there were many voices and there were many conversations, and sometimes it was clear, and you can see this also in the book as well, as there are which is maybe perhaps not very common in poetry books. There are actual footnotes sometimes that show where there's a quote and who is quoted, but then there are these boxes where you're not quite sure. So I think for me, there were different layers of voices and different layers of conversations that were happening. So there were the actual quotes, like the one I quoted in the beginning, of recognizable, completely different voice, completely different writing or sound or verse, and then there were the boxes that were somewhere in between, and then there was the either a character or the voice of the I, in a way that's observing or that's experiencing things, or that is perhaps using these characters, such as the little girl, to understand and to sort of feel out the world or to feel out the body and whatever it's experiencing. So I think in my mind, these boxes were somewhere in the middle. They were not quite the speaker, but they were not quite a quote all the time. Sometimes they're actual, they're even nursery rhymes that, or even perhaps prayers that are not quite recognizable as it comes from there, but the sound of it sort of comes through, and in that sense, it is like a voice that's coming from somewhere. It's like when in your mind there's something you're remembering, there's a text you're remembering from somewhere, but you're not quite sure how it figures in that moment, but it's in that moment, in the sense of wrong connections, I guess.
Yeah, and then it's cued that, you know, this is something that was packaged in my brain. It came from somewhere. I no longer particularly know where, but I know that it felt very relevant, and I've remembered it again. And so it has relevance. And it feels like a person is being constructed. And I found it really interesting how long it took before the pronoun I was ever used. And I think I made a note of it. It's not until the bottom of page 7. And when it occurs, it's a quote. And so you don't know whether you should believe in that I as being behind all of these utterances or just another quote. But then once it's introduced, it continues or it picks up again at the top of page 8. But after that, it goes missing because we get something like wrote down the words in large letters, then prayed to be able to stop her. And so it seems really very curated in terms of how present that I is going to be on the stage of the book. She's going to sometimes hide, she's going to come back in, she's going to come in a costume, you're not going to know whether it's the real I. But over time, something accrues, a sense of a speaker with experiences. I can't imagine the challenges for you as a translator with something like that. Maybe it's just a matter of like hanging on in a roller coaster and just knowing that, you know, we're going to have those highs and we're going to have those dips. Can you talk about that sense of some embodiment in the text?
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about this, because I feel like I've been in this book experiencing it for so long that even when I wrote the translator's note, I had to take some time. I had to take some months away from the book to actually be able to talk about it, because it was really, it was an experience for me as well to translate it. And I wasn't always fully aware of, perhaps as a translator, I shouldn't say this, but I wasn't always fully aware of what it was doing, but I was sort of experiencing it too. I think with the I, this was something that I did think about, because Romanian also, it's also mimicking Romanian in this. So as a language in Romanian, the I does not always have to be, it doesn't always have to be stated because it's implied in the verb. So the verb has the I in it as well, and it's quite common not to not to specifically state the I. But I felt that in this book in particular, the way that I was reading it was that it wasn't that it was not it wasn't specified, which would have perhaps been a little bit odd. But there was a lot of play with that. I think she was actually engaging with that part of Romanian where it can be ambiguous who is speaking, when they're coming in, who they're speaking through. So that was something that I was definitely thinking about and that I enjoyed, because there is it as you're reading this book in Romanian, it feels like at times you're not sure who is speaking, whose experience and whose body you're in at that moment. If it's a horse, if it's a little girl, if it's the speaker, who is even the speaker. So I think playing with when the I comes in and when it goes out was part of what I was trying to do, I think, to show how I was experiencing the Romanian, at least.
Well, and what's also interesting is it says in 1940. And so we know, if we know the age of the author, it's not the author who's a 3-year-old child at that point. And so then, because the grandmother, we think, well, is this her mother? Which she could have been, 3 years old in 1940. So I really enjoyed that sense of not just a particular person's experience in the world, but history, and a personal history. But because this comes from a country that also has a very, well, every country has a history, but a history that is kind of written sotto voce underneath this, for those people in that country would know what was going on in 1940, for instance, whereas we don't. Is that something, I know you talked about that actually in your translator's note, that there are particular moments where there is a kind of either a sense of menace or a sense of a past trauma, that those words would communicate, just the setting, the name of the town, whatever. Is there a temptation to try to somehow bump that up closer to the surface?
I think It's interesting. It at times I think it was, and particularly in the more recent history moments, like the 80s, which I know more of because it was closer to when I was a kid. Um, but I think something I appreciated was that it was, so I came to this book because I also had a relationship with the author. We're friends, and it was, I never wrote in Romanian, and I mean, I still never write in Romanian. I only write in English, and there are a lot of there's a lot that I haven't had a chance to experience as a writer in Romanian. So I think in some ways translating this book has given me an opportunity to experience certain things, perhaps such as some very deeply seated historical trauma through translating this book. And I mean that just in the sense of what language carries without us knowing that it carries it. I think I have a theory that something happened to Romanian during communism and during that time of heavy secret police oppression, that it changed the way people can, or if they even can, be vulnerable in Romanian. And I'm really interested in how that's moving through language and how that's moving through poetry and how poets are dealing with that. And I think that that's part of what perhaps addresses the trauma or the way that history is addressed in this book, that there is maybe there's an inability of language to fully say these are the traumas we're dealing with, so we're going to explore it through these senses, because this is the only thing that the language can hold at this point. And I'm sure that perhaps there are many other poets that feel differently, but I think for me that was something that was really attracting me to the book. And I think it's something that I found a book, and I don't think it's quite a stretch to assume that it's there, because there are historical data, there are moments that talk about recent Romanian historical history, but they're very subtle. It's almost as if they're not there, but they are there. And there's violence, and then there's trauma that it's almost as if it's not there, but it's there. And I think that was in the Romanian, I think the inability of the language to perhaps deal with that full on or say it full on, if that makes any sense.
I think it does, and not just because of fear, but because of being reductive. You know, when you take something that is that complicated, where it becomes the fabric of people's lives, who are you to come after the fact and boil it down to statements about how people felt? So I think that, you know, it's much more true to someone who's living today, who has heard those stories from a grandmother, from a parent, from history books, to just have a sense of uneasiness that's left over. But let's talk about how you came to this book, because you mentioned you knew the author, and maybe we'll even go a step backwards in terms of your relationships to different languages. So you speak modern Greek, French, English, and Romanian. Did you grow up in Romania? And when did you begin to acquire these other languages?
Yeah, so I lived most of my life in Romania, and I think English was always in the background, and at some point it became my language of literary and sort of intellectual activity and academic activity at some point in college, and then and none of these, maybe it has to do with the Romanian school system too, that I never really, it was never like a choice. I'm going to take French. Like you were introduced to French. That was a class you had to take. So then I learned French that way. And then the language that I feel I really chose to learn was modern Greek, because that's what I applied to in college. And for some reason, I wanted to learn modern Greek. So it was the first time that I consciously, as an adult, worked hard at learning a language. But I think all of those languages, perhaps, and wanting to learn all those languages, spoke to that sense of growing up in a language space where there was an inability say certain things, or there was an inability to write for some reason. And I do think it has to do with, if you live in an environment where for a long time it's dangerous to be outspoken and it's dangerous to say anything, then you stop saying things. There's a story that that's in one of the articles on postcommunism, that the people who came back from political prison never talked about it, and their families, their closest friends wouldn't know that they did political prison because they would never talk about it again. So I think that does something to language, that does something to how people engage with language. So maybe a lot of these other languages, I think, compensated for that or offered avenues to speak that. So and then in terms of, so there became this, I think, this performativity to how you use the language, especially literarily. In school, I read all the canonical works of Romanian literature, where it's one of those cultures where there's a canon and you read the canon because that's what you're assigned in school. And in 2014, when I started my MFA at Iowa and I was writing in English, Andra Rotaru came there through the international writing program in a residency. And honestly, to my great regret, that was the first time that I'd met a contemporary Romanian poet, someone my age or close to my age, of my generation, that was writing in that moment. So I think, and it was interesting because I think in a lot of ways there were very similar concerns around language, around where Romanian could be taken, how far it could be expanded. And I kind of had the same concerns in English. How far could I take English? What could I do with English? So it came pretty natural that I would start sort of translating her work. And then so I've had access to this book as it came to be in its different parts and its different iterations. So it's been quite a personal journey for me, I think, to translate this book and to be in contact with Andra throughout the process of her publishing the book and then working on the translation. Sorry, that might have been too much.
No, it's
much
perfect.
more in the question.
I watched a very short video, I think it was less than 10 minutes, of her when she was at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And she said that she had read Maggie Nelson's Bluets, and that was the most interesting book she had ever read, and that it gave her ideas for taking these kinds of fragments. And so I assumed that was the impetus for this entire book. But had she been writing in this style before then?
She had been writing prose poetry before then as well. Her previous book, Lemur, which has been translated in English from Action Books, also is largely in prose poetry as well. But I think the poetry essayistic style of Bluets and the way that the way that Maggie Nelson, I think, plays with sentences perhaps expanded or offered Andra an opportunity to take Romanian, the Romanian line, if that's something we could talk about in that direction as well. So I think while that was an inspiration, I think what she ended up doing with it was definitely her own, and it was a very unique turn on prose poetry.
Well, and she seems clearly from the book itself, where she notes and incorporates quotes from different writers, she has exposed herself to a lot of American influences, I think primarily from the language poetry side, although, there's Anne Carson and Claudia Rankine. We don't consider those language poets, but they certainly have been influenced by the language poets. And so she talked also about the generation, the poetic Romanian generation of the 2000s. And I imagine that you're in that same generation. So did something happen in terms of some of these works being translated into Romanian, where poets began to see how people were taking form and kind of, turning their back on it, but keeping some of the traditional lyric substrate and making something new out of that.
Absolutely. Certainly. I think the from what I've read and from what I've seen, I think the 2000s generation, of which I suppose I'm one of as well, is I think it's a generation that strives for innovation in poetry. I think they're I mean, if you think about it, we're the first generation that's fully grown up outside of like the legacy of communism, and all that it brought in terms of censorship and a certain kind of hierarchy of poetry. But we're also, I think, a generation that's kind of not necessarily rejected, but looked away from perhaps the more French Academy cultural influence on poetry and on or self-taken on by other Romanian poets. And I think it's a generation that looked to innovate and looked to innovate at the level of language. So I think when poets started to go abroad, or they would get copies of books perhaps from the language schools or other American poets from those generations. I think they kind of perhaps filled a void in and offered some opportunities in terms of innovation and where the younger Romanian poets could take poetry. And I think quite a few are doing a lot of really amazing work in that sense. And it's changed the scene, I think, surely.
I think this is the perfect time to kind of like engage with some more poems from the collection Tribar. And I think we will encounter some animals as well.
Absolutely. Content not found. What am I remembering? A long corridor behind rows of chairs, a paper bag I'm trying to breathe through. 21 hours remaining to destination. The smell of the airport, an amalgam of acronyms and flight boards. Food in the rages over the flavor of food. First layover, the algae move around the bodies. Water infiltrates everything. Let's lower air underground, pull down our masks from the survival kit. Dig for victory, we want your kitchen waste, pig food, no warning, so always carry your gas mask. Catacombs lay ground over ground, bones dig out bones. Traces are easy to lose, this is the state, a crumbling. Passion, don't renounce your body, with it come fury, despair, helplessness. In the name of the Father and Son, I'm afraid. Anomalies of this living. This is what living should look like. I separate breath from breath, a stable season. Goodbye, my dear, be safe, be good to yourself, be risky. When cold surrounds us, entire kilograms of humanity attract each other and begin a breaking apart. Go and make new memories. Friends, lovers, or nothing, nothing. Him I trust, and nothing cannot turn into something other than what it is. You are not what you own. If I could break apart this air for a short period of time, it comes together and apart by other rules. When I miss the smell of sugar, I open the door. 3 years old, my hair is blonde. Through it pass air and a sweet aroma. Sometimes I head towards the water. I stick my tongue to the salt crust. From a distance, my grandmother's gesture calls out to me. In between these sensations of the past stays water with its smell of chlorine, dead skin, the child's body soaked in heat. The body's shocked when it's pulled out of there. You are abused and you abused yourself. What is a smell? A voluntary sensation, a joining together. Evolving out of the past, it creates a welcoming space in the body of this moment. I breathe it in, then breathe it out in a different strength. How old are you if you don't know how many years you have? The noise is loud, the noise is produced anyway. I thought I'd find you both in the living section and the dead. I shouldn't touch you. I had been told that I'd grown up and such gestures are forbidden. Out of this body I first met you. You asked if I was me. With every movement, I lose my strength, have learned, however, how to sleep. 1, I discovered that the face changes. If I pull the skin from under the eyes, I can see tears form. In vain I cry around others. First I take the beatings, then they leave me alone. 3, I have low tolerance for separations. The body reacts violently. It harms itself. It's almost impossible to help it. The poor coordination of steps and sound that distorts. Can sound hold weight? It's one of the moments when I don't run. From the arms, soon it was summer and memories everywhere. Later lights came on, wind blades, the white of a ship's generator, the green stone moss off the cornices of houses. The body will take only so much abuse and then it'll bulk. Philip Roth. Out of the species of migrant birds, I can't prohibit my own nature.
This is another selection where there are boxes, and it's fascinating because they each, well, there are 4, and they act so differently. So 21 hours remaining to destination is in this long, narrow, kind of like a ruler box. And it might be, you know, a sign, a neon sign or something that goes on. And then dig for victory. We want your kitchen waste, pig food, and then for a girl, no warning. So always carry your gas mask. And that gas mask again, and even victory suggest World War II. And then we have another long, narrow one. Goodbye, my dear, be safe, be good to yourself, be risky. And that, it's fascinating. And then the last one is you're not what you own. And it's almost like a fortune cookie because we associate those long little pieces of paper with some short, pithy statement about, you know, the essence of life or something like that. So you are not what you own. But each of those could talk to the other one. How did you, I mean, it must have been a surprise in a sense, each time you experience this.
Yes, and I mean it's sometimes a surprise even as I read it. And I think something I actually purposefully didn't ask her about where each one came, because it seemed like there were such moments of also found language that was I think it was interesting for me also as a translator to not always have an explanation of this is how this fits in. And it brings me back constantly to the idea of a tribar, of things that are not supposed to connect and somehow they connect. And I feel like oftentimes in poetry, especially in my experience of writing, there are moments where I'm not sure why these things are connecting, but they're coming off on the page or they're coming out on the page, and then perhaps later they're connecting in my head. But there's an experience of writing, perhaps out of what I guess I often think about, you know, through writing, and especially like free writing or found language. I think about Kristeva's idea of the semiotic and the symbolic, you know, that space, and the idea that perhaps poetry comes from that space that's underneath reason and underneath like consciousness and language that's fully formed in specific thoughts. And I think for this one, for all of these boxes, I sort of tried to let them be and just have faith that they're somehow connecting. And if they're not, then they're not supposed to anyway, if that makes sense. But that perhaps for every reader, it could connect in a different way.
Well,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think that clearly this book wants you to get into the story and kind of participate in the construction of the narrative. And each person will do that slightly differently. And as soon as you think that you're on a trajectory, then we get one of these little things and you think, is somebody in, you know, still in the airplane? No, because now we're wearing a gas mask and now we're eating maybe a fortune cookie, you know? So it's really, it's a lot of fun, but it's not easy. And, the audience for it will self-select, I imagine.
Absolutely. And also I feel like it's not easy because a lot of this experience does come out of anxiety. If just looking at those first lines, trying to breathe through a paper bag, and it suggests that you're on a plane and 21 hours to your destination. It's quite a long plane journey to experience anxiety through. And in that sense, I think it is in some ways, it made me think like, oh yeah, this is what it's like to be in your head when you're having one of these anxious moments. It's all of these bits of language that come, at least for me, my experience of a panic attack at least, is having all these random bits of language that come in and somehow either build up or bring down or just move it up and down. And I thought it was really, as a translator, it felt really extraordinary that could be sort of recreated in language through these moments of found language, I think, ultimately.
I mean, since one of the main metaphors is connection or wrong connection, and that kind of like is also the metaphor for the tribar, as kind of like the illusion of a figure, of illusion of kind of a triangle where actually the lines are connected. That seems to be also a perfect metaphor for the translation process in a way. And movement was very present in especially these passages in this section of the book. And the other constant kind of like recurrence is body and body parts. And how do you, so this is also a triangle, movement, connection, and body. How did you encounter and how did you talk about her kind of like poetic connection game when you were working together as in Iowa? Was it a theme?
I think at the time, like in Iowa, this was not the particular project that we were sort of engaging on. I think we had quite a few just conversations around poetry and like what language can do and where it can go, if that makes sense. But just in thinking about the process of translation, it does remind me that I think for me there's always I think this book was a great exercise in because like the idea of a triangle is also about stability in a way, but in this case it's about like stability that's actually not very stable. And I think in some ways the process of translating this was like that to me. Like I always had to remind myself not to force the stability on the text because the text itself is not stable. But as a translator, sometimes you want to stabilize it. You want to put it down and be like, oh no, I get you. I know what you are, and just sort of allow it to sort of surprise me and to not make sense sometimes. And yeah, I think movement is part of that as well, right? Like it's not a static, it's not a fixed text, that it's a constantly moving text, which does have to do, I think, with her work with choreography and I think she thinks a lot about movement just in terms of the body, and what movement represents for the body, and breath a lot. And I think anxiety is a sort of an important sort of emotion behind a lot of what of the sensations that this poetry is trying to explore and understand. And that's, I think perhaps that's why breath comes back so many times. It's right, trying to understand what, because ultimately breath isn't something that you can really control, or and I think when you're starting to explore meditation, one of the first things you have to learn is how to stop trying to control your breath and just watch it and not control it as you're trying to watch it, which I think for me was one of the hardest things always. And I think in some ways this poetry acts like that too, where you're I think I felt like I was trying to I always had to sort of observe it even through the process of translation, and not try to not try to dominate it through like fixing it in English, if that makes sense.
And were you translating some of her work in Iowa?
No, I think I was perhaps playing around with some of her poems that were already translated, but they were never like sort of straight up translations that I ever published. I think after that, as this book started to come to be, and I started translating them bit by bit as and you know, one of the great experience I had with that was that I would translate for her, and then I would maybe attend an event where she would do a reading and I would hear her read. So I think a lot of my translation of the whole book was I had her voice in my head and I knew what it was supposed to sound like, or I knew what she sounded like when she was reading them. And I think that informed some of the movement that I'm doing in language and the translation as well.
And would she also read them in Romanian?
Oh, she would mostly read them in Romanian.
Okay. And then you had translated some of them, and so would she read those translations in English?
For some events, she's read them in English, and for others, I think there was one event where I read it in Romanian. I read it in English, and she read it in Romanian, if I'm not mistaken.
So
it's been a while.
That her voice got into the translations, it was her voice in Romanian.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. And will you translate more of her work?
Yes, I'm actually I'm looking forward to see more of her new work and to see where it's going now after this book, and what else she's exploring. It is it's I don't know how you, because I know you also have a very a great career as a translator, but I wonder how you're also exploring this. But I think something I'm finding is that it's always great to, like, after a book, sort of like pause and exit that voice for a while and then come back to it a little bit later. I don't know if that's something that you could also speak to as well. Perhaps that's an advice I could take.
Well, I think it's true, because each voice, each book that you translate requires you to have a different relationship to it. So when I'm translating Dante, for instance, that's not the same as when I translated Shuzo Takiguchi, a Japanese poet. I did that with a native Japanese speaker. I don't speak Japanese, Yuki Tanaka, but we had to figure out what Shuzo Takiguchi's voice was. And he was a surrealist. He wrote between 1927 and 37, and he was deeply immersed in French surrealism. He was translating Breton. He translated surrealism and painting 2 years after it was published in France. And he also was reading a lot of American and English poetry, and his favorite poet of all was Blake. So how does this Japanese person speak in their poems? You know, it took us years really to figure that out. So with Dante, how does Dante speak? Well, you know, we have all of these translations. You begin with the Inferno, there are over 200. And he's speaking like someone who lived a long time ago, sometimes using thou'st, canst, you know. And so if you decide you're going to lower the register of that language, where are you going to find a person that speaks like him when you've never heard him? So yeah, I think that it's part of the thing that makes translation so interesting, is to listen so carefully that you know what someone sounds like, and then to somehow incorporate those sounds in the new language.
Yeah, and it's interesting you're mentioning sort of like translating and working across like two different languages, because my impulse after this is to, well, I'm working on my own book of poetry, which has some experimental translation aspects in it from French and German, but that's very much my book and that's very much my poetry. But in terms of translation, I was actually I was attracted to the idea of translating something from modern Greek because for some reason it felt like I lived from Romanian to English for long enough, and I sort of needed a different, a sort of, because it's also like a very, I think it's a very heavy, it can be a very heavy relationship for me to translate from Romanian to English because I care a lot about the Romanian, or I'm very, I'm very dedicated to the Romanian being carried in a certain way in English. Like I was mentioning, the I, that was something that I feel like it was a struggle with every within this translation to make sure that I'm sort of honoring the way the I comes across in the Romanian. Not that I wouldn't be as careful with the Greek, but it's a different relationship, so it feels differently. I don't know if this maybe goes too much into like translation world, but it's
No,
interesting too.
Yeah, no, and I imagine that that's what the audience is interested too in. So would you translate the modern Greek into Romanian or into English?
Oh, into English. Because I don't write in Romanian, I feel like I wouldn't have the tools to translate in Romanian. Like it does feel like a process of rewriting, right? In another language. And if I'm not writing in that language actively, if I don't have the if I'm not like going through the process of writing in that language, it feels like it wouldn't do service to the original, I think.
So do you consider your first language English? Even though you
No,
were
no, no, it is, I think it certainly is Romanian, but actually I've been reading a lot, and I've been exploring a lot, just this idea that perhaps there's no such thing as a mother tongue. I've been, as Matthias and some of the people in the audience know, I've been really fascinated by like Derrida's monolingualism of the other, and just this idea that there's perhaps the way I'm looking at it is there are relationships to different languages, and there's no hierarchy perhaps in those relationships. You just perhaps do different things in different languages. You live different lives in different languages. So I think the creative writing life for me is in English, and it doesn't feel like it would move into Romanian anytime soon. And then I have a very different, very rich life in Romanian as well, but it's not writing, unfortunately.
Interesting.
Or fortunately, I don't know.
We heard in the poem you gave us 15 minutes ago. At the end of this section were the migrating birds, which came in and which were so moving in a way, and that kind of like it connects with what you were talking about right now. So those migrating birds, probably the only untraumatic events in the whole poem, something really the other, seems to be also a stand-in for this movement beyond the borders of language, right? The process you are writing in, you are living in, which I find so fascinating about this collection, and also about your own poetry collection, Exophony, because it kind of like really, I think this might be why you felt so attracted to Tribar and to her work, because I think you have something very similar there. This a search for a space without sentimentality, without really calling this home or this stability, to just like really kind of like moving along and making something new out of this movement, which I find very, very modern. The interesting difference might be, since you are also including experimental translation and the work of others in your own collection, she's doing this through quotes in Exophony, and we can already have a teaser because this is also going to be a really brilliant book which we will talk about and present here in the writer series. Exophony kind of like goes in a different direction. Could you kind of like talk a little bit about the structure of Exophony? I think that might be interesting too.
Right. So it is quite a different direction, and that So that book comes out of a project of research, of experimental translation, because of translation's inability to really contain everything that my research was giving me. So basically, it started out by as I was translating the small book by Tristan Tzara that he wrote during World War I in Zurich as the Dada movement was founded, and then in that book finding traces of these women poets and dancers who aren't mentioned in the histories of Dada, and then just following the trace and tracing them across time and different places in Europe, which is why I'm in Europe right now. It's research I'm doing this semester into it, and then sort of realizing that there are all of these archives that hold these documents, and those are supposed to be the repositories of history and of the history of this art movement, but they don't contain a lot of the work that these women did during that. I think inspired a lot of the theoretical aspects of Dada, and the reason why those works aren't kept is because archives are essentially sort of an academic, patriarchal, and colonial project at the end of the day, that perhaps were not designed to hold work that could not be institutionalized, that was sort of interdisciplinary, that was dance, or that was forms that weren't written down on paper. So then I think what my book is, what I'm trying to do in my book is to recreate an archive by undoing an archive, essentially, and thinking that poetry might be a way of writing that fights against all the principles of academy, of what holds historical truth, and perhaps presents a different kind of truth through different kinds of connections and through different kinds of documents. There are less documents, if that makes any sense.
But it's interesting because Dada is a self-marginalizing, group of actors, and so they don't want that, supposedly.
Right.
And it's only us who later want those documents, but you could see that they would not, make them precious, because that was in fact what they were resisting, is this kind of deification of art and creativity. And they were like, stop it, let's just have fun and put down those ideas.
Absolutely, which is why it's ironic that I think it started out that way in Zurich during World War I, but then later on, as the years went by, Breton, I think, definitely institutionalized some of the principles of Dada through surrealism, and then of course Tzara, had even in all the papers he left to the Jacques Doucet Library. There was a clear move towards institutionalizing that which he said could not be institutionalized, but it ultimately could. So I think it's interesting that, despite the fact that there was this impetus, which perhaps I would argue didn't necessarily come from them, but perhaps it did come from artists who were dancers and painters and all of it at once, and would carry a theme throughout all of these different forms of art. And that was Sophie Teuber-Arp and Emmy Hennings, and the poet I'm working on right now, Maya Kruzek, but perhaps because they actually couldn't be institutionalized, we don't have a lot of histories written about them.
Since it is 4 a.m. in the morning over in Romania, I think this is a perfect way to end our session today. Thank you so much, Mary Jo Bangs. Thank you so much, Anca. And Anca, would you wave us off with one last poem or one last section of a poem from Andra Rotaru's wonderful work Tribar? And let me just and this is really the end of our session today. I want to kind of end it really with the poet's words. Let me just raise my invisible glass of champagne to you and the success of your book. We will not have a reception after our session because Anca needs to sleep. And to the rest of you, please join us again for the International Writers Series in April. It's going to be, I think, the 12th of April. It's a Wednesday once again, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this lovely conversation. And I will leave you with a quick poem. What does it mean to fall in love? Cells revive their memory, something learned a long time ago. It reappears now. Love is just as empty before becoming one. Lord, I'm one. Lord, I'm two. Lord, I'm three. Lord, I'm four. Lord, I'm 500 miles away from home. Thoughts, what do you think? When there's nothing that goes on and nothing to separate from, we improvise a middle ground where we can rest. This new rudimentary space with no joining, connecting the parts of any other world. The body learns to rest. The noise of its settlement there doesn't exist either. Physical sensations, what you feel. I'm learning to separate emotions, their energy, a conglomerate, the discomfort of one and the euphoria of the other one. Behaviors, what you do, not to think, not to perceive, to return to a space where I was once okay, a temporary settlement. The weak muscles of the body, the rudimentary sketch of this place, script for me and script for him. I've never seen a body so young, exhausted. And you, with which one of us will you head home? I never carried the body like a child. I never saw it as a friend. Joy in this abandoned country through which memories pass, where nothing connects to something else, where there are no fingerprints left. I am. Thank you so much for this evening. Yeah, this has been absolutely lovely. I couldn't imagine a more beautiful and fruitful and lovely conversation to kick this book off. So I hope you enjoy it, those of you who have access to it.
Well, thank you for staying up and for all of your interesting answers. And it's lovely to be a part of a book like this.
And we can't wait for have a physical copy in hand. And as Walter shared with us, the official release date is in a couple of days, the 15th of March. We had the opportunity to already have a PDF, an electronic version in front of us, and it's definitely worth it. So please go to your local bookstore, support them, and support Anca and Andra. Thank you.